On June 24, 1812, Napoleon entered Russia with 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen. He left in December with 27,000. The Russian army did not destroy him. The Russian army barely fought. The cold did. Here is the meteorological murder of the Grande Armée. The force Napoleon assembled was not simply large. It was a system designed to move fast, strike hard, and force a decisive battle within weeks. 600,000 soldiers required 4,000 tons of food and fodder every single day just to remain functional in the field. That number was never a secret. It was a structural fact of every Napoleonic campaign that had worked before in Central Europe. The doctrine was simple. March fast, live off the land, find the enemy army, destroy it, and dictate peace terms before winter made supply impossible. It had worked at Austerlitz, at Jena, at Wagram. Victories measured in days, not months. The Russian theater was far larger than the compact Central European battlefields Napoleon had mastered, and the distance from the border to Moscow was something his supply chain had never crossed before. The cavalry units alone required 40,000 horses, each consuming 10 kilograms of fodder daily, in a country where the roads turned to mud with the first rain. Every previous campaign had ended before those numbers became fatal. Russia would not. The political logic was equally clean. Force Tsar Alexander to the table, restore the continental system, and secure France's eastern flank before Britain could exploit any weakness. Napoleon had broken the same formula across Europe for 15 years, and there was no empirical reason, as he entered Russia, to believe Russia would be different. The Russian General Staff had spent the previous decade watching Napoleon break armies by forcing decisive engagement, and they had drawn the obvious conclusion: do not engage. Barclay de Tolly, the Russian Minister of War, had articulated a withdrawal strategy as early as 1807. Fall back, extend French supply lines, deny forage, burn what cannot be carried, and let the geography do the killing. The strategy was politically unbearable inside Russia. Withdrawing hundreds of miles without fighting felt like cowardice to the nobility and the officer class. But it was strategically sound, in a way that no European opponent had been willing to execute before. Scorched earth was not improvisation, it was doctrine. Russian cavalry units were assigned systematically to burn grain stores, hay depots, and fodder stocks ahead of the French advance columns, ensuring that the land the Grande Armée occupied produced nothing edible. The villages along the main road to Moscow were not simply abandoned. They were stripped and burned, leaving French foragers nothing but ash and the frozen ground beneath it. Napoleon's army moved into a vacuum of supply on day one, and the vacuum deepened with every kilometer. The two Russian armies, the first under Barclay and the second under Bagration, refused to converge and stand for the decisive battle Napoleon needed, retreating separately and preserving their fighting strength. The Russian leadership changed command twice under domestic political pressure. Kutuzov replaced Barclay in August, but the strategic logic of denial and withdrawal survived every change of general because it was not a personality choice, but a geographical one. The killing started before August. The summer of 1812, in the western Russian steppe, was abnormally hot and dry, with temperatures regularly reaching 35 degrees Celsius on the march, and the roads generating dust clouds that blinded columns and clogged lungs for hours at a stretch. Dysentery hit the army within 2 weeks of crossing the Niemen River, moving through crowded bivouacs with no clean water and no sanitation infrastructure on a road system built for peasant carts, not army corps. The horses began dying in July, not from cold, but from lack of fodder. The foraging parties sent ahead to gather feed found burned fields and empty barns, and the heavy draft horses pulling the artillery were the first to collapse from malnutrition. When a gun horse died, the cannon it pulled either had to be redistributed to an already weakened team or abandoned at the roadside. And the artillery train, the force multiplier Napoleon relied on for every major engagement, began shrinking before a single shot had been fired in a field battle. Casualty estimates for the period from June 24 to September 1st, the summer phase alone, run between 80,000 and 100,000 men lost to disease, heat exhaustion, starvation, and desertion before the campaign's famous winter had begun. The army that crossed the Niemen on June 24 at 600,000 was already below 500,000 by the time it approached the Russian defensive line at Borodino in early September, and it had not yet fought a single major engagement. Kutuzov chose to stand at Borodino on September 7, 1812, on ground he had selected deliberately, a position where the French could not use their superior maneuver doctrine to flank and encircle, but had to attack frontally into prepared Russian defenses. The battle that followed was the bloodiest single day in the Napoleonic Wars, with approximately 70,000 casualties combined, 35,000 French and 44,000 Russian, and it ended with Napoleon holding the ground but failing to achieve what the campaign required. He needed the Russian army destroyed, prisoners taken by the tens of thousands, and Kutuzov's force rendered incapable of further resistance. The Austerlitz outcome that had made surrender negotiations possible before. None of that happened at Borodino. Kutuzov withdrew the Russian army in good order, preserving its core fighting strength, leaving Napoleon in possession of a battlefield and nothing more. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's operational reserve, 20,000 elite troops he had used to deliver the decisive blow at every previous major battle, was held back because Napoleon refused to commit it without certainty of a final breakthrough that never materialized. Borodino cost France 35,000 irreplaceable men, most of them experienced veterans from the corps that had broken every European army for a decade, and it produced no strategic result. The road to Moscow was open, but Moscow was not the war, and Napoleon had just spent his last viable attacking force on a victory that could not be converted into peace. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14, 1812, and found it empty. The population of 270,000 had evacuated, and Russian Governor Rostopchin had ordered the city burned, not as a last act of desperation, but as a calculated extension of the denial strategy that had governed Russian behavior since June. The fires that broke out on the first night and burned for 6 days destroyed 3/4 of the city's buildings and, more critically, most of its remaining food stocks and fodder depots, leaving the French army an intact shell of a city with no resupply value. Napoleon waited in Moscow for 5 weeks, from September 14 to October 19, expecting Tsar Alexander to send a peace delegation and end the war on terms. Alexander never responded. The 5-week delay was not tactical or logistical. The army's supply situation was deteriorating in Moscow, not recovering. It was Napoleon's psychological failure to accept that the campaign's premise had already broken down irreversibly. Every day spent in Moscow consumed food the army needed for the retreat, exhausted horses that could not be replaced, and burned off the calendar days before the Russian winter arrived in full force. The French occupied a burned city, stripped it of whatever food and valuables remained, and waited for a political outcome that Russian strategy had been specifically designed to deny them. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat on October 19, the temperature had already dropped below freezing at night. The first frost had hardened the roads, and the army had less than 6 weeks before the deep Russian winter made movement on the open steppe a death sentence. The meteorological record for October 1812 in the Moscow region shows a sharp cold snap arriving on October 18, the night before Napoleon ordered the retreat, dropping overnight temperatures to -8 degrees Celsius and catching the departing army without winter clothing, without adequate shelter, and without the horse fodder that would have kept the draft animals pulling the artillery alive. The army that left Moscow on October 19 numbered approximately 100,000 soldiers, already reduced from the 600,000 that had entered Russia, carrying food stocks for perhaps 3 weeks, and moving along a road that Russian forces and the army's own passage in September had stripped of every farmhouse, haystack, and grain store. The cavalry ceased to function as cavalry within the first week of the retreat. Horses that had been malnourished since July could not sustain the combination of sub-zero temperatures, inadequate fodder, and the load of mounted soldiers in a frozen landscape, and they began dying at a rate that eliminated the army's scouting and screening capability entirely. Without cavalry screens, Cossack raiding parties, light, mobile, and intimately familiar with the terrain, began hitting French columns from every direction, cutting off stragglers, destroying supply wagons, and preventing the army from foraging or resting. The temperature on November 6 dropped to -21°C, and the army had no winter uniforms. Napoleon's supply doctrine had not included them because the campaign was supposed to be over before November. Men wrapped themselves in whatever they had stripped from Moscow's buildings: curtains, carpets, women's shawls, anything that interrupted the wind. Frostbite casualties overtook combat casualties by a ratio of approximately 10-1 in November, and the category of soldier who survived the day but could not march the next morning began filling the roadsides with the dying. The Berezina River crossing of November 26 to 29 was the campaign's final catastrophic bottleneck, a river that should have been frozen solid and easily crossable, but had partially thawed 4 days before the army arrived, leaving floating ice chunks and black water between the French and the western bank. Russian General Chichagov had positioned his army on the western bank to intercept the retreat, and Wittgenstein's forces were closing from the north. Napoleon's army was briefly caught between 3 converging Russian forces, with a partially unfrozen river between them and safety. French engineers, the Corps of Pontonniers, worked in chest-deep, near-freezing water for hours on November 26th to construct 2 bridges under fire, losing most of their number to hypothermia in the process, and the crossing that followed over the next 3 days cost between 25,000 and 30,000 lives among the soldiers and civilian camp followers who did not make it across before the bridges were burned. The human cost across the full campaign is recorded in the categories of how men died rather than any single battle. Approximately 70,000 killed in action, 80,000 to 100,000 dead from disease in the summer phase, 200,000 to 250,000 dead from cold and exposure during the retreat, 100,000 captured across the campaign, and 100,000 deserters who either surrendered or made their own way out. The 27,000 who recrossed the Niemen in December were not survivors of a battle. They were survivors of a climate, a supply failure, and a strategic miscalculation that had been visible in the arithmetic of the campaign from the first week of July. The 1812 campaign did not fail because of Napoleon's mistakes at the tactical level. Borodino was fought competently, the Berezina crossing was executed with technical brilliance under impossible conditions, and the operational art of the French corps system functioned as designed. It failed because the Napoleonic system of war was structurally dependent on conditions Russia was specifically positioned to deny. The doctrine of living off the land, requisitioning food and fodder from occupied territory rather than maintaining long supply lines, had made the French army the most mobile and operationally flexible force in Europe. That mobility was the source of every major victory from 1796 to 1811, and it was the source of the 1812 catastrophe, because it assumed the land could feed an army the size of a mid-sized European nation on the march. Russia's scorched earth response was not a new idea. It was a known counter to exactly this kind of army, and it worked with mathematical precision. The campaign also revealed the structural weakness of Napoleon's political theory of war, the assumption that a decisive military victory would produce a negotiated settlement. Alexander refused to negotiate after Borodino, refused to negotiate after Moscow fell, and refused to negotiate after the retreat began. Not out of irrationality, but because he understood that Napoleon's strategic position was deteriorating faster than any peace terms could recover. Weather was the accelerant, not the cause. The cause was a strategic system optimized for short, decisive campaigns that met a geography, a climate, and an opponent who had correctly identified its single point of failure. Every major power that attempted to occupy Russia, from Charles XII of Sweden in 1709 to the German Wehrmacht in 1941, encountered the same convergence of distance, winter, and denial, and every one of them found that the combination could not be overcome by tactical excellence alone. The Grande Armée was the finest military instrument of its age, and the Russian winter did not care.